I had been waiting for this morning for 38 years. Not because of anything grand or exciting, but simply because it was finally mine. My name is Ruth Calloway, and the day I turned 63, I hung up my nurse's uniform for the last time. 38 years of night shifts and double shifts, of holding strangers' hands through the hardest moments of their lives, of missing birthdays and Christmases and quiet Sunday mornings. And now, on my very first day of retirement, I was sitting at the kitchen table in my son's house, drinking a cup of chamomile tea, watching the birds outside the window peck at the feeder I had filled just the day before. The morning was soft and golden. I had nowhere to be. For the first time in decades, I had absolutely nowhere to be. I closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath. Then the back door swung open hard enough to rattle the frame. My daughter-in-law, Sandra, walked in still wearing her gym clothes, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun. Her expression tight with the kind of irritation she never bothered to hide around me. She dropped her gym bag on the counter and looked at me sitting at the table with my tea, and something in her face shifted. She reached over, grabbed the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and tossed it at me across the table. It landed on top of my teacup. I looked down at it, then up at her. She put her hands on her hips. "Since you're just sitting here anyway," she said flatly, "you might as well make yourself useful. The laundry has been sitting in the machine since yesterday, and we need dinner ready by 6. You're not working anymore. This is the least you can do if you're going to be living here." I did not say anything. I just looked at her. My son Marcus came down the stairs then, already dressed for work in his gray blazer, his leather shoes clicking on the hardwood floor. He glanced between me and Sandra and gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. "Mom, Sandra's not wrong," he said, straightening his watch without looking at me. "You know how expensive things are right now. The mortgage alone is brutal. We're not asking for much. You're here all day. It just makes sense for you to help out around the house." He picked up his travel mug from the counter and took a long sip. "Besides, it'll give you something to do. You'll go crazy just sitting around." He said it as though he were doing me a favor, as though turning his 63-year-old mother into the household servant was a kindness he was graciously offering. I wrapped both hands around my teacup. The chamomile had gone cold. I looked at my son, really looked at him, the way I used to look at him when he was small and had done something he knew was wrong but was pretending he hadn't. He had the same expression now that he'd had at 7 years old when he broke my good mixing bowl and blamed the cat. But he was not 7 anymore. He was 39. And I was not going to pretend I didn't see what was happening. I thought about the nights I had driven him to the emergency room when his appendix burst at 14. I thought about the 2 jobs I had worked after his father left so that Marcus could play soccer and go to summer camp and not feel the shape of what was missing. I thought about the down payment I had given them 3 years ago, $50,000 from my retirement savings, so they could buy this house. I said very quietly, "All right, you two go on to work. I'll take care of things." Sandra gave a small, satisfied nod and picked up her bag. Marcus hesitated at the door for just a moment. I thought for just 1 second that he might say something different, something that sounded like the boy I had raised. Instead, he said, "The bathroom grout needs scrubbing too. Sandra's been on me about it for weeks." Then the door closed, and I was alone in their kitchen with a cold cup of tea and a dish towel in my lap. I sat there for a moment very still. The birds were still pecking at the feeder outside. The washing machine hummed somewhere down the hall. I stood up slowly, walked to the laundry room, opened the machine, and looked at the wet pile of their clothes sitting inside. Then I closed the machine door without touching a single thing. I walked back through the kitchen, down the hall, and into the small spare room they had given me when I moved in 18 months ago. The room was tidy and plain. A single bed, a dresser, a small closet, a window that looked out onto the fence. On the dresser was a framed photograph of Marcus at his college graduation, me standing beside him with my arm around his shoulders, both of us squinting into the sun. He had the biggest smile I had ever seen on his face that day. I stood looking at that photo for a long moment. Then I pulled my old green suitcase out from under the bed. It had a small wheel that didn't work right and a zipper that stuck, But it had been with me since a trip to Portland I had taken with my best friend Helen 15 years ago. I set it on the bed and opened it flat. I began folding and packing. Quietly, steadily, the way I did everything. Clothes first. Then the photo albums on the shelf. My Bible. The small wooden jewelry box my mother had left me. I worked without rushing. I had learned long ago that the worst decisions were the ones made in a hurry. But this was not a decision made in a hurry. This had been coming for 18 months if I was honest with myself. 18 months of Sandra sighing whenever I cooked something she hadn't asked for. 18 months of Marcus telling me I was too sensitive when I said something bothered me. 18 months of feeling like a guest who had worn out her welcome but hadn't been given the courage to leave on her own. Well, now I had been given the push. I reached under the mattress and pulled out a small brown envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a number written on it, and a bank card with a PIN I had memorized. I had been setting aside $200 a month since I moved in, telling myself it was just in case. I put the envelope in my purse. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed for a moment, just to breathe. My husband Gerald had passed 6 years ago. Lung cancer very fast, only 4 months from diagnosis to the end. Before he went, he held my hand in that hospital bed and said to me, "Ruthie, you have always been the strong one. Don't you forget that after I'm gone. Don't let anyone make you small." At the time I had wept and told him to stop talking like that. But now, sitting on the edge of this bed in my son's spare room with my suitcase packed, I heard his voice as clearly as if he were standing in the doorway. I stood up, zipped the suitcase closed, and wrote a short note on the notepad on the dresser. I placed it face up on the kitchen counter where they would see it. It said, "I have gone to find some peace. Please don't worry. I love you, Marcus. Goodbye, Sandra." I wheeled my suitcase to the front door, put on my good walking shoes, and stepped outside into the morning air. It was still cool. The neighborhood was quiet, just the sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the street and a dog barking 2 houses over. I walked to the end of the block and called a car on my phone. The driver was a young woman who smiled at me in the rearview mirror and asked where I was headed. I told her downtown. Just downtown for now. She nodded and turned on the radio, something soft and instrumental, and I watched the familiar streets slide past the window. The hospital where I had worked for 22 years. The church Marcus had been baptized in. The park where Gerald and I used to walk on Sunday evenings. I pressed my hand flat against the cool glass of the window, not waving goodbye, just touching. I asked the driver to drop me near the Riverside Inn, a modest hotel I had passed 100 times and never entered. The lobby was clean and quiet, with a small fountain near the reception desk and chairs upholstered in a dark burgundy. The woman at the desk smiled warmly and asked if I had a reservation. I told her I didn't. She found me a room on the 3rd floor, facing the river. It was small, but there was a cushioned chair by the window and a decent lamp and a bed with clean white sheets. I set my suitcase down, sat in the chair, and looked out at the river moving slowly below. People walked along the path beside it. A man walked his dog. 2 children ran ahead of their mother, arms out wide. I watched them and felt something in my chest unclench, very slowly, like a fist that has been closed for a long time finally opening. I reached into my suitcase and unzipped the inner pocket where I kept my most important papers. I drew out a thick envelope and laid the contents across the small side table. There were documents, official and carefully organized, that I had been quietly tending to for years without anyone knowing. Gerald, for all his gentleness, had been a practical man. 3 months before he died, he had sat up in his hospital bed, more alert than he had been in weeks, and said, "Ruthie, I need you to write some things down." And I had written them down. Every account number, every policy, every deed. He had made me promise to keep it all to myself. "Not because Marcus isn't a good boy," he said, "but because you should have things that are yours alone. A woman needs ground to stand on." I had kept that promise. Looking at the documents now, spread across the table in the yellow afternoon light, I counted up what I had. There was the small rental house on Davenport Street, a 2-bedroom bungalow Gerald and I had bought 15 years ago as an investment. A couple had been renting it faithfully for the past 4 years. There were Gerald's life insurance proceeds, carefully invested through a financial advisor my friend Helen had recommended, steady and growing. There was a small savings account I had built on my own, $150 a month for 12 years, never touched. Taken together, it was enough. More than enough. It was a life. A whole, complete, comfortable life, needing nothing from anyone. I put the documents back in order, folded them neatly, and placed them back in the envelope. I picked up my phone and called Helen. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, as if she had been expecting me. "Ruth," she said. "Something happened." It was not a question. I told her about the dish towel, about Sandra and Marcus and the cold tea, about the note on the counter and the suitcase and the hotel room by the river. Helen listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I loved most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for just a moment. Then she said, "Okay, but now here's what we're going to do." Helen was a retired attorney. She had spent 30 years in family and estate law. She was also the most no-nonsense person I had ever known, and she had been telling me for a year and a half that I needed to move out of Marcus and Sandra's house. She began talking, calm and organized, laying out a clear and practical path forward. "The Davenport tenants," she said. "Their lease is up in 3 weeks. I've been keeping an eye on it for you just in case. I can call them tomorrow and confirm whether they're renewing or leaving. If they're leaving, you can move straight in." I felt a warmth move through me at that. My own house, Gerald's and mine. I knew every room of it. I had picked the color of the kitchen myself. "Helen," I said, "don't say anything to Marcus yet. I don't want him showing up at my door with apologies and excuses before I've had time to breathe." "Understood," she said. "Take the weekend. I'll have information for you by Monday." We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the time I hung up, the light outside had shifted from afternoon to early evening, and the river was going gold. I took a long, unhurried shower, changed into a comfortable sweater and loose trousers, and went downstairs to find somewhere to eat. The hotel restaurant was small and half-empty on a Wednesday evening. I ordered a bowl of tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich, the kind of meal I had not allowed myself to eat for dinner in years because Sandra kept a strict low-carb household. I ate slowly, watching the other diners, listening to the quiet clinking of silverware and the murmur of other people's conversations. A couple near the window were laughing at something on one of their phones. An older man sat reading a paperback, a glass of red wine at his elbow. Nobody knew me here. Nobody needed anything from me. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling, not loneliness exactly, but a kind of wide open space where pressure used to be. I ordered a piece of apple pie for dessert and ate every bite. Back in my room, I sat in the chair by the window and did something I had not done in a very long time. I simply thought. Not about work, not about what needed doing, not about how to keep the peace in that house. I thought about what I actually wanted. I had retired from nursing, but I was not done. I was 63, not 93. My knees were fine. My mind was sharp. I had 30 years of medical experience and a patience that had been forged through decades of caring for people on their worst days. I also knew, more clearly than ever, that I did not want to spend whatever time I had left being someone's unpaid help. I wanted to teach. I had been thinking about it quietly for years. The community college 2 miles from Davenport Street offered a certified nursing assistant program. I had looked at it online more times than I could count. The next morning, I called the community college and asked about their CNA program instructor position. The woman who answered was helpful and cheerful and told me they had been looking to expand their program for months. She said the director, a Dr. Pauline Foster, would love to speak with someone with my experience. We scheduled a call for Thursday afternoon. I felt something move in me when I hung up, something quick and bright, like a window being opened in a room that has been shut too long. I spent the rest of the morning walking along the riverfront path, hands in my pockets, watching the ducks and the joggers and the slow, wide movement of the water. I stopped at a bakery and bought a coffee and a cinnamon roll and sat on a bench in the sun. An elderly man sat down at the other end of the bench, and we nodded to each other in the companionable way of strangers sharing a good morning. That evening Marcus called. I let it ring the first time. Then he called again and I picked up. Mom. His voice was tight in a way I recognized. Not worried exactly. More like a man who has come home to an empty house and realized for the first time what that actually means. Where are you? I'm fine, Marcus, I said. I'm safe. I just needed a change of scenery. What does that mean? Sandra found your note. Mom, you can't just leave without telling anyone where you're going. I noticed that the first concern he named was the note, and the second was Sandra, and that he still hadn't asked if I was okay. I told you in the note, I said, that I was fine and that you shouldn't worry. I meant it. Silence on the line. Then, did something happen? Did Sandra say something? I thought about how to answer that honestly and simply. We had a difference of opinion about my role in your house, I said. I decided I needed some time to think. Marcus started to say something else, something that was beginning to sound like the kind of speech where the other person tells you that you're being oversensitive, and I said, I'm going to go now, Marcus. I'll be in touch. And I hung up. I sat on the bed in my hotel room for a moment, my phone in my lap, feeling the weight of what I had just done. Not the call. The leaving. 18 months of small daily erosions. And it had taken a dish towel to finally show me the shape of what I had been absorbing. I was not angry. That surprised me a little. I had expected anger, maybe, or grief. What I felt instead was a kind of exhausted clarity. Like when a patient finally tells the truth about how much pain they've been in and you can finally begin to actually help them. I lay back on the clean white pillow and slept the deepest sleep I had in months. Thursday's call with Dr. Foster went better than I had dared to hope. She was warm and direct and clearly knew her field. She asked me detailed questions about my nursing background, my experience with training junior staff, my approach to clinical education. I answered easily, naturally. This was my language, the one I had spoken for 38 years. By the end of the call, she said she wanted to have me meet the rest of the program team the following week. I won't pretend we aren't excited, she said. Someone with your level of floor experience and your years of training nurses is not something we see very often. I thanked her and set the phone down on the bedside table. My hands were steady. I was smiling. On Friday, Helen called with good news. The Davenport tenants had already been planning to move out at the end of the month. They had been quietly looking for a larger place for the new baby that was coming. Helen had spoken with them that morning, and they were warm and gracious, grateful for the years of tenancy. Happy to wrap things up early if that helped me. The house would be mine again in 2 weeks, 3 at the most. I sat with that news for a while, turning it over the way you turn a smooth stone in your hand. Davenport Street. The house where Gerald had built the garden bed in the backyard and painted the porch railing himself one July and got more paint on his shirt than on the railing. I had been renting it out for 4 years and had not stood inside it once. I had not been ready. Now I was ready. I decided I would drive past it that afternoon just to look. I rented a car for the weekend, a small practical thing, nothing fancy, and made my way to the other side of the city. Davenport Street was quiet and familiar. The oak tree in front had grown considerably. The porch was in good shape. The garden a little overgrown, but nothing a few hours of work wouldn't fix. The tenants had put a small wind chime on the porch that caught the light and turned slowly. I sat in the car across the street for a few minutes, not going in, just looking. A neighbor walked by with a stroller and gave me a polite wave that told me she didn't recognize me. That was fine. I would introduce myself properly once I was settled. I drove back to the hotel with the windows down and the radio on. That weekend I did not think about Marcus and Sandra at all. That was not a deliberate choice. Just something that happened naturally when I was busy being present somewhere else. On Saturday I walked through the farmer's market and bought fresh bread and a bunch of sunflowers, because I had always loved sunflowers and Sandra thought they were gaudy. On Sunday I found a small church near the hotel that had a morning service with good music, and a minister who gave a short, honest sermon about the courage it takes to start over. I sat in the back pew and sang the hymns I had known since childhood, and when the congregation around me sang too, something in my chest lifted clean and free. After the service, a woman about my age with silver locks and warm eyes introduced herself. Her name was Patricia. She asked if I was visiting and I said, in a way, and we both laughed. Patricia turned out to be a retired teacher who had moved to the area 2 years ago to be closer to her grandchildren. She had a quick mind and an easy laugh, and she insisted I join her and a few others from the congregation for lunch at a nearby Jamaican restaurant. I said yes, partly because I was hungry and partly because I was learning to say yes to things again. The food was wonderful, the company lively. I ate curried chicken and fried plantains and listened to 5 women of various ages talk and argue and laugh about everything from local politics to their grandchildren's peculiarities to the best way to treat dry skin in winter. Nobody asked me anything I didn't want to answer. By the time we said goodbye outside the restaurant, Patricia had saved my number and promised to text me about the Tuesday morning walking group she organized. On Monday, Helen sent me a message with the final details about the Davenport house. Everything was moving smoothly. The tenants would vacate by the 20th. Helen had already called a locksmith she trusted to rekey the locks and a cleaning crew to do a thorough sweep before I moved in. I would need to bring a few things, a bed, a kitchen table, the basics, and the rest I could fill in gradually. I made a list. It was a good list, practical and forward-looking, full of small decisions that added up to a home. I bought myself a notebook at the hotel gift shop and wrote the list in it in blue ink, neat and organized. Gerald had always teased me about my lists, said I made a list for my lists. I pressed my hand flat on the open page and smiled. Tuesday I met Patricia for the walking group. There were 6 of us that morning, women ranging in age from 58 to 71, walking a 3-mile loop through the park at a pace that allowed conversation. It was brisk enough to feel like exercise and relaxed enough to feel like pleasure. Patricia introduced me simply as Ruth, her new friend, and no one asked me more than I offered. We talked about the weather and a new restaurant someone had tried and a book one of the women was reading. It was light and warm and entirely without obligation. I walked beside a woman named Carla who had the straightest posture I had ever seen and who turned out to be a retired civil engineer with a passion for orchids. She told me about her greenhouse with such obvious joy that I found myself wanting to see it. Later that day, Marcus texted, "Just 2 words, call me." I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I typed back, "I'm doing well. I'll reach out when I'm ready." He didn't respond immediately. I imagined Sandra reading the message over his shoulder and the look on her face when she did. Then I put the phone away and went back to my notebook. I was working on a rough plan for the teaching material I might develop for Dr. Foster's program. 38 years of knowledge, distilled into something I could pass on to people who were just starting out, people who would one day do what I had done and care for strangers on their hardest days. It felt meaningful in a way I hadn't anticipated. More than meaningful. It felt like a purpose that belonged entirely to me. The following Wednesday, I met with Dr. Foster and her team in person. The community college was a busy, cheerful place, full of students in scrubs carrying textbooks, which made my heart lift unexpectedly. Dr. Foster's office was small and covered in stacked papers and anatomical diagrams and photographs of previous graduating cohorts. She shook my hand with both of hers and introduced me to 2 other instructors, a man named Tom who had been a paramedic for 20 years and a younger woman named Yolanda who was finishing her master's in healthcare education. The 4 of us talked for 2 hours. It was the best 2 hours I had spent in a very long time. By the end, Dr. Foster offered me a part-time position, 2 days a week to start, with the possibility of expanding the following semester. I accepted without hesitation. I called Helen from the parking lot, still in my car, and told her. She made a sound that was equal parts delight and vindication. "Ruth Calloway," she said. "I have been waiting for this phone call for 3 years." I laughed. A real laugh from somewhere deep. "Don't say I told you so." "I absolutely am saying it," she said. "And I will keep saying it. Now about the move. I have a furniture place in mind. Very good prices, very solid quality. I'll send you the address." Helen had, in 24 hours, arranged moving logistics, a furniture recommendation, and was already talking about a housewarming dinner. I told her she was too much. She told me I was not enough and we had always balanced each other out. She was right about that. The following Sunday, Sandra called. I had expected Marcus to be the one to make contact, So Sandra's name on the screen surprised me a little. I let it ring twice, then answered. She sounded different than usual. Less certain. Less like someone who had just tossed a dish towel at a woman and told her to earn her keep. "Ruth," she said. And then nothing for a moment. Waited. "I wanted to see how you were doing." It was not an apology, but it was something. "I'm very well," I said, keeping my voice even. "Thank you for asking." Another pause. "Marcus has been really upset," she said. I noted that she led with Marcus, not with herself. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, which was true. I did not want my son to suffer. I wanted him to understand. Those were not the same thing. "Are you planning to come back?" Sandra asked. Her voice had that quality it sometimes had when she was asking for something and trying to make it sound like she wasn't asking. I recognized it now more clearly than I ever had when I was living under the same roof, being worn down daily by all the small ways I had learned to accommodate her. "No," I said. "I won't be coming back to live with you and Marcus. I'm in the process of moving into my own home." Silence. Then, "Your own home? Where?" "That's my business, Sandra," I said, not unkindly. "What I can tell you is that I'm well and I'm happy, and I would like to stay in civil contact with my son. I hope that's possible." She said she would tell Marcus. I thanked her and ended the call. I moved into the Davenport house on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks and 1 day after leaving Marcus and Sandra's house with my green suitcase and my envelope of papers. Helen came with a car full of casseroles and cleaning supplies and an opinion about every piece of furniture I had bought, most of which I agreed with. Patricia came in the afternoon with a potted herb garden and her easy laugh and helped me arrange the kitchen. Carla came by at the end of the day with a bottle of sparkling apple cider and 3 glasses, and we sat on the porch in the cool evening air, the wind chime turning above us, and we toasted to nothing in particular and everything in general. The house smelled like fresh paint and lemon cleaner and something warmer underneath, like memory, like coming home. Gerald's garden bed was in rough shape but still there, the frame he had built by hand still solid and square. I crouched beside it and pressed my fingers into the cool soil. Overgrown but salvageable. Just needed attention. I thought about what I might plant. Tomatoes. He had loved tomatoes, would eat them off the vine like apples. I thought, for the first time in a long time, about him without the particular weight of grief. Just with love, clear and uncomplicated. I stood up and brushed the soil from my hands. Inside, Helen was organizing my kitchen and arguing with herself about which cabinet made most sense for the tea things. I went in and we argued together which was better. That night, alone in my own house for the first time in 5 years, I lay in my new bed in the room I had chosen, the one with the window that looked out onto the backyard, and I listened to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening. Car passing. Dog. Someone's wind chimes further down the street. I was not sad. I was not afraid. I felt instead a kind of steady, quiet fullness. Like a cup that has finally been filled to the right level. Not overflowing, not half empty, just right. I thought about Gerald saying, "Ruthie, don't let anyone make you small." I thought about the dish towel in my lap and the cold tea. I thought about the note I had left on the counter and the suitcase and the clean hotel room and Dr. Foster and Patricia and Carla and the garden bed and the tomatoes I would plant in spring. I closed my eyes and went to sleep. The first week on Davenport Street was full of small discoveries. The way the morning light came through the kitchen window at an angle that lit up the whole room around 8 o'clock. The neighbor across the street, a man named Douglas who waved every morning and whose dog, an enormous golden retriever named Captain, once got away from him and ran straight to my porch and sat down as if he lived there. The way the oak tree in the front made a sound in the evening wind that I had apparently missed without knowing I missed it. I bought a small bistro table and 2 chairs for the backyard and had my morning tea there most days, watching birds and squirrels and the slow business of a garden waking up. I had my first class at the college 2 weeks after the move. Tom met me in the parking lot and walked me to the building, which I appreciated, and introduced me to the students with such generous praise that I felt I had to earn it immediately, which I supposed was the point. There were 16 students in the cohort, ranging in age from 19 to 52. Their reasons for being there were as different as their faces. Some were changing careers. Some were supporting families. Some were there because a family member's illness had lit something in them that they needed to follow. I stood at the front of that classroom and felt 38 years of hard-won knowledge arrange itself behind me like a resource I had never fully examined until now. Began to teach. Turned out I was good at it. Not in a performing way, but in the way of someone who has simply done a thing long enough to understand its weight and wants to pass that understanding on. The students were engaged. They asked good questions. When the class ended, a young woman named Destiny, who had told me in the first 10 minutes that she was terrified of IVs and wasn't sure she could do this, came up afterward and said the way I explained things made it feel possible. I told her that feeling possible was how everything hard began. She nodded seriously, wrote something in her notebook, and went off to her next class. I stood in the empty classroom for a moment, feeling something settle in me that I did not have a precise word for. Something like rightness. Marcus came to see me on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after I had moved in. He came alone without Sandra. He stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the house with an expression I couldn't read immediately. I had seen him drive past twice the week before without stopping, and I had let him. He had needed to work up to this, and I had needed him to work up to it. I opened the door before he knocked. We looked at each other. He looked tired. A little older than the last time I had looked at him closely. "Mom," he said. I said, "Come in. I'll make coffee." He followed me inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway while I put the kettle on, looking around at the house, at Gerald's photographs on the wall, at the herb garden Patricia had given me on the windowsill, at the ordinary evidence of a life I had built on my own. He sat down at the kitchen table and I brought 2 mugs over and sat across from him. For a while neither of us said anything. Then he said, "She was wrong to do that. Throw the towel at you like that." I looked at him. "And what you said," I said quietly. "About my only use. About not expecting to live for free." He looked at the table. His jaw tightened. "I know," he said. "Mom, I know. I'm not going to make excuses." That surprised me. I had been prepared for excuses. "Sandra and I have been having a hard time," he went on. "Money, work, everything. And I took it out on you because you were there and you were safe. And that's not okay." I held my mug with both hands. "No," I said. "It's not. I didn't mean it," he said. "About your only use. I was being an idiot." "You were," I agreed. He looked up at that, a flicker of surprise, maybe expecting softness, maybe expecting me to tell him not to worry. I just looked at him evenly. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke very slightly on the word, just enough that I heard it. "I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry." I let the apology sit for a moment. I did not rush to accept it, but I did not push it away either. "I know you love me, Marcus," I said finally. "And I love you. That didn't change. But how I choose to spend this part of my life and where I live and what I give my time to, those things are mine. And they were never yours and Sandra's to direct." He nodded. He looked young suddenly. Not the man who had talked to me about Social Security and household costs. Just my son. "Are you happy here?" he asked. "Very," I said. And meant it. We talked for 2 hours that morning. Not about Sandra mostly. Not about the dish towel or the note or any of the events of the last month. Just about things. His job, which was stressful. A trip he and Sandra were thinking about taking. Something funny that happened with his car. Normal things. The kind of conversation we had not had in a long time because we had been too busy managing the low-grade tension of 3 people living in a house that only worked for 2 of them. When he stood up to leave, he looked around the kitchen again and said, "This is a good house, Mom." "I know," I said. "Your father picked it." He smiled at that, a real smile this time, and I walked him to the door and stood on the porch watching him drive away, Captain the golden retriever barking from across the street. Helen came for dinner that evening. She brought wine and bread and asked me every detail of the visit, as she was constitutionally incapable of not asking every detail of everything. I told her. She listened, nodding, processing, and when I finished she said, "Good. That's the beginning of the right thing. Not the end, the beginning. I poured the wine and agreed. We sat at the bistro table in the backyard as the sun went down, listening to the oak tree and the wind chime and the small sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening. I told her about Destiny, the nursing student who was afraid of IVs. Helen said that was her favorite part of the whole story. I said it was mine too. We finished the wine and she went home and I washed the glasses and went to bed early with a library book I had checked out that afternoon. A novel about a woman who sailed solo across the Atlantic at 64. I read 30 pages before I fell asleep. In early November, something happened that I had not anticipated. I received a letter from the hospital where I had worked for the last 22 years of my career. It was from the director of nursing, a woman named Dr. Margaret Holt, whom I had known for years but who had taken her role only after my retirement. She wrote that several of the senior nurses in the ICU had cited me specifically by name as the person who had trained them and shaped their approach to patient care, and that she was aware of my new teaching role at the college. She wanted to know if I would be interested in serving as an advisory consultant for their nursing education and mentorship program. Part-time, flexible, paid, and starting whenever I was ready. I read the letter twice at the kitchen table with my morning tea. I called Dr. Foster at the college first. She already knew, it turned out. Dr. Holt had contacted the college before reaching out to me. As a courtesy, Dr. Foster was enthusiastic. She thought the hospital connection would be enormously valuable for her students, providing potential placement opportunities and real-world contact. She said she was proud to have hired me. I thanked her and hung up and sat in the morning light for a long moment. 6 weeks ago I had been sitting in another kitchen with a dish towel in my lap, and the sense that my usefulness had been reduced to laundry and floors. And now 2 professional institutions were asking for what I knew and what I had spent a lifetime building. I wrote a reply to Dr. Holt, accepting with great pleasure. Sandra called again the week after Marcus's visit. This call was different, less stiff. There was something underneath it, something that sounded cautiously like an effort. She told me that she and Marcus had started seeing a counselor. I said I was glad to hear that. She said the counselor had asked them both some hard questions about how they treated the people in their lives. I let that sit in the air between us without commenting. Then she said, "Ruth, I know what I did was disrespectful. I don't know if you want to hear that, but I'm saying it." I told her I heard her. She asked if they might bring dinner sometime, all 3 of us. I said not yet, but perhaps in a few weeks. I told her to let Marcus know I'd be in touch about Thanksgiving. She said okay and thanked me and we hung up. And I stood at the window watching Captain the Retriever chase a squirrel across Douglas's lawn. The weeks passed in a way that felt new and full. Teaching 2 days a week at the college. Consulting 1 afternoon a week at the hospital. Walking Tuesday mornings with Patricia's group. Gardening on weekends as the weather allowed. Reading in the evenings. Calling Helen when something funny happened, which turned out to be often. I bought bird feeders for the backyard and learned, from a small book I found at the library sale, to identify most of what came to eat. White-throated sparrows and dark-eyed juncos, and a single extremely confident cardinal who sat on the fence every morning and looked at me as if we had an appointment. I named him Gerald. Helen thought that was ridiculous. I thought it was entirely appropriate. One Tuesday afternoon in late November, after the walking group had finished and Patricia and I had gone for coffee, she asked me something she had been building toward for a few weeks. I could tell by the way she approached it, carefully and sideways, like someone stepping onto ice they weren't fully sure about. "My friend Robert," she said, stirring her coffee, "has been asking about you." Robert was a man who came to church sometimes and who had joined the walking group twice. He was quiet and easy to be around, a retired high school principal with a dry sense of humor and the kind of attentiveness that made it clear he was actually listening when you spoke. "Patricia," I said. She put her hand up. "I'm just telling you what I know," she said. "He asked me if you might be interested in dinner sometime." Just dinner. I looked at my coffee. I thought about Gerald. About the oak tree and the wind chime and the cardinal on the fence. "I'll think about it," I said. Patricia smiled into her cup. "That's all I'm asking. On the walk home, I thought about Robert and his careful listening and the way he had laughed, genuinely, at something Carla had said about orchids. I thought about being 63 and having a whole, full life that was entirely my own and not belonging to anyone's list of chores. I thought about Gerald saying, "Don't let anyone make you small." I did not think he meant by that to also make myself small by refusing every good thing. I texted Patricia when I got home. "Tell Robert yes to dinner. Just dinner." She sent back a response that was nothing but exclamation marks. I stood in my kitchen and laughed until my eyes watered. Thanksgiving that year was at Helen's house. It was the first Thanksgiving I had spent somewhere other than Marcus and Sandra's house since Gerald died, and the first one in years that I walked into without bracing. Helen cooked a turkey and Patricia brought sweet potato pie and Carla brought something involving orchid-adjacent garnishes that looked extraordinary and tasted wonderful. Marcus and Sandra came, which I had invited them to, carefully and on my terms. A phone call 2 weeks prior in which I had said clearly that I was glad to include them if they came with warmth and left any trace of the last 18 months at the door. They came with warmth. Sandra helped in the kitchen without being asked and said please and thank you and laughed at things other people said. Marcus sat beside me at the table and put his hand over mine when the grace was said, and I let him.
Thank you for being here. We are halfway through the story, and if you haven't subscribed to this channel, kindly subscribe to this channel because there is more amazing stories upcoming. Kindly let's continue with the story.
After dinner, Marcus and I sat on Helen's back porch while the others washed up inside. It was cold, but neither of us suggested going in. He asked me about the college and I told him about Destiny, who had passed her first practical assessment with a confident hand. He smiled. He asked about the hospital consulting and I explained what it involved, and he listened with a focused attention that he had not given me in years, the kind that said he was actually hearing what I was saying rather than waiting to respond. At some point he said, "Mom, do you know that I used to brag about you? At work, to my friends, to anyone who'd listen. My mom's been a nurse for 38 years. She's the hardest working person I know." I looked at him. "What happened?" "Yes." "Not bitterly. Just honestly." He shook his head slowly. "I got tired and I took it out on you. And that was wrong." He nodded. "Yes," I said. "It was." We went back inside and Helen was serving the apple cake and Patricia was telling a story that had everyone at the table leaning in. And for a while the whole room was just warm and full and easy. I caught Sandra's eye across the table and she gave me a small, careful nod. Gave her one back. It was not forgiveness exactly, not yet. It was more like a door held open an inch. I thought that was enough for now. Room to move forward slowly in the right direction. After the dishes were done and the guests had gone, Helen and I sat at the kitchen table with the last of the wine and the comfortable exhaustion of a good day. "Happy?" she asked. "Very," I said. It was the same word I had used to answer Marcus. And it was just as true. In December I had dinner with Robert. It was a Thursday evening, a quiet Italian restaurant downtown, the kind with low lighting and real candles and bread that came before you'd even looked at the menu. He was already at the table when I arrived, reading the wine list, and he stood up when he saw me, which I appreciated more than I expected to. We talked for 3 hours. He had grown up in Georgia, taught for 30 years, moved north when his wife's family was here, and stayed after she passed 4 years ago. His children were scattered but close, and they called him every Sunday. He asked me questions and listened to my answers and did not try to impress me or manage me or require anything. He was, I thought, watching him talk about his oldest grandchild learning to ride a bike, a genuinely good person. Simple and important. Walking out afterward into the cold December air. He asked if I would like to do it again sometime. Said yes, I would. He smiled in a way that was both happy and self-contained. Not too much, just the right amount. We walked to the corner and said goodbye, and I drove home through the lit-up December streets feeling warm and thoughtful, and not at all like someone who needed to be anywhere other than exactly where she was. At home I made chamomile tea, the kind I had been drinking the morning the dish towel landed in my lap, and sat in the armchair by the window and thought about the shape of the last few months. How a single terrible morning had cracked something open. How inside the crack there had been, waiting patiently, An entirely different life. Christmas came. I decorated the Davenport house for the first time in 5 years, which meant hauling down Gerald's and my old ornament boxes from the storage space and spending a Saturday morning with carols on the radio rediscovering objects I had packed away in grief. The ornament that Marcus had made in 2nd grade from a toilet roll and glitter. The glass bird Gerald had bought at a market in Vermont the year we drove there for our anniversary. The strings of lights that Gerald had always taken an hour to untangle, patient and methodical, while I stood making increasingly impatient suggestions and he smiled and ignored them. I hung them all slowly, feeling the house fill up with something that was not the ghost of the past but the presence of it, held warmly. Marcus and Sandra came for Christmas morning. Sandra brought a poinsettia and a box of chocolate truffles, both of which were genuine and without subtlety or agenda. Marcus helped me carry a chair from the garage and fixed the back door latch that had been sticking since October, doing it quietly without announcement, the way Gerald used to fix things. We had breakfast together, eggs and toast and the Danish pastries Sandra had picked up. We talked about normal things. After they left, I sat in the armchair by the window and looked at the room with its lights and ornaments and the poinsettia on the table. And I thought that some broken things, if given time and honesty and the willingness of the right people, could be repaired into something that held. In January, 2 things happened that I had not expected. The first was that Destiny, my nursing student who had been afraid of IVs, passed her certification examination on the first attempt. She texted me at 7 in the morning, a string of capital letters and exclamation marks, and I texted back with equally capitalized congratulations. And when I told Helen, she said she was going to cry and I said I already had. The second thing was more complicated. I received a call from a woman named Sylvia, who introduced herself as Gerald's younger sister. I had not spoken to Sylvia in 4 years. We had been close once, and then something had shifted, some family tension that I had never fully understood, and the contact had simply faded. She was calling, she said, because she had heard from a mutual acquaintance that I had moved to Davenport Street, and she knew the house, of course, she had been there many times when Gerald was alive. Her voice was careful and a little formal, which was not how she had used to sound. She said she had been thinking about reaching out for a long time. She said she missed me. I sat with the phone, listening to the space around those words. The careful voice behind them. The effort it had taken to dial the number. I told her I was glad she called. We talked for an hour. She was living alone now, her daughter in Seattle, her son in Atlanta. She had retired the previous year from her nursing career, which I had forgotten she'd had, or perhaps had not thought about recently. She laughed when I told her about the college teaching, a real laugh, the kind that sounded like the Sylvia I remembered. We made a plan to have lunch the following week, and when we hung up I sat for a while in the quiet house thinking about time and the ways people drift apart and the small, deliberate acts it takes to drift back. I thought about the letter Dr. Holt had sent, about Sandra's call, about Marcus on the porch at Thanksgiving, about Sylvia's careful voice saying she missed me, about the habit people have sometimes of coming back. Lunch with Sylvia was at a quiet cafe near the library. She was thinner than I remembered, and her hair was fully silver now, and she carried herself with the particular ease of someone who has weathered enough to have stopped worrying unnecessarily. We hugged on the sidewalk outside the cafe and held on for a moment longer than a casual hello, and then we went in and sat down and ordered soup and talked for 2.5 hours straight. She told me things I hadn't known. Things about Gerald's childhood, about their family, about the particular ways he had been shaped by the people who raised him. I told her things she hadn't known about him at the end, the things he had said, the way he had held my hand and given me instructions for living without him. We were quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, "He loved you more than anything, Ruthie. Anyone who knew him knew that." Thanked her. I meant it differently than I had ever meant it before. Without grief at the center of it, just gratitude. We walked along the library gardens afterward in the cold January air and made plans to meet again the following week. Walking home, I thought about Gerald's garden bed waiting in the backyard for spring, about the tomatoes, about the things that needed tending but did not hurry, that came back in their own time when the conditions were right. February was cold but busy in the good way. My consulting work at the hospital had expanded slightly. Dr. Holt had asked me to observe a new mentorship initiative she was running for recently hired nurses, and I found that my role there was becoming something I hadn't expected: less formal advisor and more trusted presence, someone the newer nurses could come to with the questions they felt too uncertain to ask their supervisors. I remembered being that person. 38 years ago, a new nurse with every confidence outwardly and every terror quietly. I tried to be what I had needed then. I thought it mostly worked. At the college, the cohort was progressing well. Tom and Yolanda and I had developed a rhythm in our teaching, and the students had developed a rhythm among themselves, studying together, covering for each other's anxieties. Destiny had become something of an informal mentor to two newer students who were struggling with the written portions of the coursework. She did it naturally without being asked, just because she saw someone struggling and had tools to offer. I watched her and felt the particular satisfaction of seeing something passed on. Robert and I had dinner twice more in January and February, and then one Saturday in mid-February he brought a thermos of coffee to the walking group and stayed afterward and walked with Patricia and Carla and me to the farmer's market and carried things without being asked. He had the quality that Gerald had, of being present and helpful in a quiet way that didn't require acknowledgement. Patricia caught my eye once and looked deliberately at the ceiling of the market stall, which was not a ceiling but the sky, and I shook my head at her and she grinned. He asked me on the walk back if I would like to come to a concert at the college music building the following week. Chamber ensemble. I said I hadn't been to a live concert in years. He said he knew. I asked how he knew. He said he'd just guessed and looked sideways at me to see if I minded him guessing. I didn't mind. The concert was wonderful. Brahms and Schubert, played by 5 musicians who brought everything they had to the small, warm hall. I sat beside Robert in the second row and let the music move through the room and through me and thought about the last time something had moved through me that cleanly. The morning I moved into Davenport Street, perhaps. Or the first day I taught. Or the moment in the hotel room when I had looked out at the river and felt the tight fist in my chest begin to open. Afterward we walked through the cold campus and he bought 2 cups of hot cider from a vendor outside and we stood drinking them and talking about the music and then about other things and then eventually we said goodnight and I drove home through the empty streets feeling full. In March I planted the garden. Took 2 weekends. First to clear and amend the soil in Gerald's bed, then to start the seedlings inside on the kitchen windowsill in small paper cups, labeled in my handwriting with a permanent marker. Tomatoes, 2 kinds. A row of basil. Marigolds along the border because they kept pests away and because Gerald had always insisted on them despite thinking they were ordinary. Carla came the second weekend and brought her gardening gloves and considerably more expertise than I had, and we worked side by side for 3 hours while she told me things about soil composition and companion planting that I filed away carefully. Douglas from across the street came over to admire and ended up staying for lunch, and Captain the Retriever lay in the yard looking satisfied with everyone's company. Spring came to Davenport Street gently. The oak tree leafed out, transforming the front of the house. The seedlings on the windowsill became actual plants. The Cardinal Gerald continued to arrive every morning, apparently having decided permanently on this arrangement. I started each day with tea in the backyard, watching the garden and listening to the birds and not rushing. I had been in the house for 5 months. I knew now exactly how the light moved through each room at each hour, which floorboard creaked, how long the kettle took, which drawer stuck and had to be lifted slightly. The ordinary intimate knowledge of a home that is yours. Marcus and Sandra came for Sunday brunch one April morning. It was their 3rd visit. Each one had been easier than the last. Sandra had changed, gradually, in ways that felt genuine rather than performed. She asked me questions about the teaching and listened to the answers. She told me once, quietly, while Marcus was in the backyard looking at the garden, that the counseling had been hard but had shown her things about herself she hadn't wanted to see. I told her that was usually how the useful things worked. She nodded and was quiet, and I thought she was actually sitting with that rather than just accepting it and moving on. I thought more of her for it. That Sunday, over eggs and the good bread from the farmer's market, Marcus said he had something he wanted to tell me. He said it carefully, looking at his plate first and then at me. He and Sandra were expecting a baby. A girl, they thought, though they were not entirely certain yet. I looked at him and then at Sandra, who was watching me with an expression that was waiting for something. I put down my fork and reached across the table and covered both their hands with mine. I told them that was wonderful. I told them I was so happy. I meant it with my whole heart, without complication or reserve. Sandra's eyes went bright. Marcus looked like himself, the real version, the boy who had grinned from ear to ear in the graduation photograph. We sat at the table in the spring light and talked for a long time about names and rooms and the particular terrifying joy of a child who is coming. After they left, I stood in the backyard for a while, looking at the garden. A grandmother. I turned the word over, feeling its shape and weight. Gerald would have been beside himself. He had always wanted grandchildren, had talked about it with the comfortable certainty of someone who assumes the future will cooperate. It had taken longer than either of us had imagined, and he had not lived to see it, but it was coming now, and I was here. I was entirely, completely here. That evening I called Helen and told her. She was so loud with delight that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Then I called Patricia, who was equally loud. Then I called Sylvia, who was quiet and warm, and said, "Gerald would have been over the moon." Agreed. I made chamomile tea and sat in the armchair by the window with the last of the evening light coming through, the garden visible in the backyard, the cardinal on the fence doing his daily review of the proceedings, and I felt the fullness of the evening settle around me like something well made and true. The spring teaching semester was drawing to a close, and Dr. Foster had asked me to consider expanding to 3 days per week in the fall. I said I would think about it, which meant yes, which she seemed to understand. Tom had started including me in the advanced simulation labs, which were my favorite part of the entire program. Scenarios played out with mannequins and careful scripting that trained students in crisis response before they ever saw a real crisis. I moved through those labs with the ease of someone who had lived the scenarios, who could talk about the thing not as a script but as a memory. The students felt that. I felt them feel it. One afternoon in late April, Destiny stayed after class to show me something. She had been accepted into an accelerated Bachelor of Science in Nursing program at the State University. Full scholarship. She had applied on her own, told no one until the letter came, and when she showed it to me her hands were shaking slightly with something that looked like disbelief. I told her there was nothing to disbelieve. I told her this was the beginning of a very long road, and that the road was going to be worth it. She asked if she could stay in touch after the program ended. I told her she'd have a hard time getting rid of me. She laughed, really laughed, and went out into the hallway, and I heard her call her mother on the phone before she'd even reached the stairs. In May I received an invitation that I had to read twice to be sure I had read it correctly. It was from the State Nursing Association, requesting that I present a keynote address at their annual conference in September. The topic was intergenerational mentorship in clinical nursing, specifically the role of senior nurses in shaping the next generation's clinical identity. The invitation had come through Dr. Holt, who had recommended me specifically, and through Dr. Foster, who had apparently been saying enthusiastic things about my teaching on a fairly regular basis. I sat with the letter at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I called Helen. "A keynote," Helen said. "Ruth." "I know. A keynote address at the State Nursing Conference." "I know. You retired 6 months ago thinking your only use was laundry." I was quiet for a moment. "I never thought that," I said. "Sandra and Marcus thought that." "And you let them think it for 18 months, Helen said, with the gentle precision of a good attorney. "Yes," I said. "I did. And now I'm giving a keynote address," I said. Helen made a sound of deep satisfaction. "I want front row seats," she said. "Done," I said. The summer passed like a gift. I finished the spring semester, took a week of real rest in which I gardened and read and had Robert over for dinner twice, and took a day trip with Patricia and Carla to a botanical garden 2 hours away where Carla was practically overcome by the orchid conservatory. I began writing the keynote in June, slowly, with care, the way I did everything that mattered. Not a formal paper but a story, told honestly about what I had learned in 38 years and what I was still learning, about what it meant to pass knowledge from one pair of hands to another, about the students who had taught me as much as I had taught them. Marcus and Sandra came to Davenport Street frequently through the summer. The visits easy now. The shape of our relationship reformed around honesty rather than management. Sandra's pregnancy was going well. They were getting the second bedroom ready. Once, Sandra asked me if I would help choose the crib. We drove to 3 different stores over a Saturday afternoon and argued pleasantly about mattress firmness and bar spacing, and she bought me lunch afterward and we talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with babies or the past. I drove home thinking that repair was possible, that it was a real thing, not a sentimental fiction, but an actual achievable thing that required time and honesty and 2 parties willing to try. In August, the tomatoes came in. Gerald's bed, tended through the spring and summer with Carla's guidance and my own patient attention, produced an extraordinary amount of tomatoes. More than I could eat, more than I could give away to Douglas and Patricia together, though I tried. I made sauce and froze it. I made a large batch of tomato soup and brought it to the college and left it in the break room. Tom sent me a message that said simply, "Best soup I've had in 10 years." I stood in the kitchen looking at that message and thought about Gerald eating tomatoes off the vine like apples in this very backyard. I thought about grief and time and the way a garden keeps coming back. The conference was on a clear Saturday in September at the convention center downtown. Helen was in the front row as promised, in a bright yellow blazer that made her look like a small, determined sun. Patricia and Carla were 3 seats over. Sylvia had driven down for it, which I had not asked her to do and which moved me considerably. Marcus and Sandra were near the back, Sandra's pregnancy visible now, and both of them looking up at me with an expression that I would think about for a long time afterward. I stood at the podium in the navy dress I had bought for the occasion, looked out at 300 nurses and nursing educators and students, and began. I talked about the first patient I had ever lost and what the senior nurse on my floor that night had said to me afterward. I talked about 38 years of double shifts and what they cost and what they gave. I talked about Destiny and her shaking hands holding the scholarship letter. I talked about what it meant to hold someone's pain long enough for them to find their way through it, and how that was the work, the real work, and how it could not be done without someone teaching you that it was possible. The room was entirely quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something true is being said. I spoke for 45 minutes. Afterward there was a long moment before the applause, a moment I had not expected, that kind of collective held breath before the room lets go. When the applause came it was sustained and warm, and I stood at the podium and received it steadily, without deflecting, the way I was learning to receive things. Helen was crying. She would deny it later. Patricia was not crying but looked as though she was actively preventing it. Sylvia was smiling the way Gerald used to smile, quietly and entirely. Marcus had his arm around Sandra and was watching me with an expression I recognized from the graduation photograph. I stepped away from the podium and Dr. Holt came forward and shook my hand with both of hers and said, "I hope this is the first of many." I told her I thought it might be. The reception afterward was full and warm, and I spoke with more people than I could count, young nurses just starting out who had questions, senior nurses who had stories to trade, educators who wanted to talk about curriculum. A woman named Frances, who ran the association's mentorship committee, sat with me for 20 minutes and asked if I would be interested in joining the advisory board. I said I would be very interested. Robert found me near the end of the evening and said, "That was remarkable." Said thank you. He said, "I mean that specifically, not just as a compliment. That was a remarkable thing you did up there." I looked at him for a moment, at the particular quality of his attention, the way he meant what he said. "Thank you," I said again differently. We drove home in separate cars and he texted when he got in to say good night, and it was a good evening. I changed out of the navy dress and made chamomile tea and sat in the armchair by the window. The street outside was quiet. The oak tree was beginning to turn, the first edges of gold and amber showing at the outermost leaves. The Cardinal Gerald had gone to bed. I sat with my tea and thought about the morning with the dish towel, now nearly a year ago. Felt far away and very close at the same time. Like something that had happened to a version of me who was real and complete but had been standing in a room with the windows closed. I thought about Gerald's instructions for living, the safety net, the ground to stand on. I thought about everything that had grown from that ground in the last year. The house and the teaching and the hospital work and the conference and Helen and Patricia and Carla and Robert and Destiny and Sylvia and the tomatoes and the cardinal and the baby coming in November. A whole, full, unhurried life, unfolding in its own time, belonging entirely to no one but me. November arrived with cold weather and early darkness and Sandra's due date. I drove Marcus and Sandra to the hospital on a Thursday afternoon when the contractions began, and I sat in the waiting room for 7 hours with a book I did not read and a cup of coffee I did not finish. And at 11:42 in the evening Marcus came out through the double doors, and his face was the face I had been waiting my whole life to see him make. That particular combination of terrified and overwhelmed and broken open with joy, and he said, "Mom, come meet her." Her name was Clara. 6 pounds 4 ounces. Sandra's nose, Marcus's chin, and the particular expression of profound disapproval that all newborns have, as though the world has been a disappointment so far but they're willing to give it a chance. I held her in the rocker in the corner of the room while Sandra slept, and Marcus stood at the window looking out at the dark city with the expression of a man who has just understood something enormous. Clara's weight in my arms was small and absolute. I looked at her face, this new face, and thought about Gerald, who would have wept unashamedly at this. I thought about the chain of it, the long unbroken chain, the passing of things from one set of hands to the next. I stayed for 2 hours and then went home and called Helen and then called Sylvia and then sat in the armchair and didn't try to read. I just sat. Clara. My granddaughter. The word was new and big and warm, and I turned it over and over in my mind like the smooth stone from earlier, feeling its weight and its rightness. The oak tree outside was bare now, its branches dark against the November sky. The wind chime on the porch turned in the cold air. I thought that by the time Clara was old enough to know what a wind chime was, the oak tree would be even larger, and the garden would have gone through several more seasons of tomatoes, and the Cardinal Gerald would have long since been replaced by his children or grandchildren, who would sit on that same fence in that same way. I thought about what I would tell her when she was old enough. Not the specific story of the dish towel and the cold tea and the note on the counter, though perhaps someday that too. But the larger thing underneath it. That a woman's worth is not located in what she does for other people, however much she chooses to do for them. That retirement is not an ending. That 63 is not old. That the things built quietly over a lifetime, the knowledge and the resources and the relationships and the inner ground to stand on, those things are yours. That the people who love you correctly will celebrate them, and the people who can't are showing you something important about themselves that you are allowed to act on. I would tell her about her grandfather, who had understood all of this more clearly than most, who had held my hand in a hospital bed and given me instructions for living without him, who had said, "Ruthie, you are the strong one. Don't you forget it." I would tell her to find people who see her clearly, who listen when she speaks, who show up in the quiet ways that matter more than the loud ones, who carry things without being asked and fix latches and sit in waiting rooms for 7 hours and tuck a scholarship letter into an envelope and send it across a parking lot to the next version of themselves. December came again, the second one. I decorated the Davenport house as I had the year before, but this time with company. Sylvia came and helped, and we found more boxes of ornaments that I had not opened in 5 years, and she named each one as it came out of the tissue paper. That one was from their mother, that one Gerald had bought on the Portland trip, that one Marcus made in 2nd grade. Yes, she remembered him bringing it home. We worked all morning and then had lunch at the kitchen table, and the house felt that afternoon like it was holding all of its years at once, which I thought was what a good house was supposed to do. Clara came for Christmas. She was 6 weeks old and entirely uninterested in the occasion, but was held by every person in the room and tolerated it with the philosophical patience of the very young. Helen held her for 45 minutes and had to be practically separated from her to eat lunch. Patricia photographed her from 17 different angles. Carla brought her a small orchid plant in a pot, and I did not tell her it was perhaps an unusual gift for an infant, but did not tell her not to do it either. Marcus and Sandra were tired and happy and present in the way that new parents are present, that particular wide-awake exhaustion that makes everything seem simultaneously enormous and exactly right. I held Clara after lunch, while the others cleared the table, and the house was full of voices and the clink of dishes and someone's phone playing music from the kitchen. She looked up at me with the ancient, serious expression she was apparently going to have for some months. I talked to her quietly, nothing in particular. Just my voice telling her things about the room she was in and the people in it and the house and the street and the oak tree outside and the cardinal who would be back in spring. She listened, or seemed to, the way very small people seem to be listening to things you cannot hear. I thought about Gerald. I said softly, "She's here. She's wonderful. Look what we made." In January, a year to the week from when I had moved into the Davenport house, I went alone to the cemetery where Gerald was buried. It was a cold, clear Tuesday morning, the sky a brilliant pale blue, the grass stiff with frost. East section, row 14. Plain granite headstone. Gerald Calloway, beloved husband and father. I crouched before it and traced the letters. I had been here 3 times since the funeral, but this time felt different. This time I came with something to report. I told him about the house and the teaching and the conference. I told him about Sylvia and Patricia and Robert and Carla. I told him about Clara, and watched a breath of wind move through the bare branches of the nearby tree and took it as his response. I told him about the dish towel. I had not told him before in the previous visits, because the previous visits had been too close to the grief of him being gone and the business of surviving without him. But I told him now. I told him about the cold tea and Sandra and Marcus and the note I had left and the suitcase and the hotel room and the river. I told him I understood now what he had been telling me in that hospital room, what the safety net was for, what the ground was for, what it meant to have something that was yours alone. I told him I was sorry it had taken the dish towel to show me, and I told him he would have hated the situation and been quietly vindicated by the outcome and probably would not have said so directly but definitely would have communicated it with his eyebrows. I stood up, brushed the frost from my knees, and took from my coat pocket the small book of poems I had brought. We had made a promise, the 2 of us, years ago. Whoever went first, the other would come and read the Robert Frost poem at the grave. I had thought of it as a romantic notion at the time, something for the far future. Now I stood by the stone on a cold January morning and opened to the page I knew by heart and read it aloud, my voice steady and clear in the winter air, the words about roads and choices and how the choosing matters and how you carry it forward. When I finished, I stood for a moment in the cold clarity of the morning, the poem still resonating in the air around me, and I felt something complete. Not closed, not over, but complete. A circle held. I placed a bunch of white tulips against the stone, which I had chosen because Gerald had always liked tulips and the florist had been out of the orange ones he specifically preferred, which felt right somehow, him managing from wherever he was to get the slightly imperfect version of the thing. I stood for a last moment just being there, and then I walked back to the car and drove home to Davenport Street through the brilliant cold morning and made tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the garden through the window, frosted and waiting and entirely ready for spring. February brought the Mentorship Advisory Board. My first meeting was on a Tuesday afternoon. A room of 12 people, mostly senior nurses and nursing educators from around the state, convened to develop formal guidelines for intergenerational mentorship programs in clinical settings. I was the newest member and the only one from a community college teaching context, which Dr. Holt had suggested was precisely the point. I sat at the table and listened for the first half of the meeting and then contributed for the second half and drove home feeling, as I often did after these things, that I had been given the exact right amount to do, neither too little nor too much. Robert came for dinner that evening. He brought bread and a bottle of sparkling water because I had mentioned once months ago that I preferred it to wine with food, and he had simply remembered and acted on it without announcement. He was good at that. We made pasta together in the small kitchen, both of us moving around the space with the comfort of people who have found a workable rhythm, and we ate at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing and the things in between. Clara was the subject of considerable time, as she often was. He had met her at Christmas and had held her with the ease of someone who had done a great deal of holding and not forgotten how. Later, doing the dishes together, he said without looking at me, "I've been thinking about saying something for a while and I've been deciding whether it was the right time." I dried a bowl and waited. He turned off the tap and stood with the dish towel in his hands, facing the window above the sink. "I think you're the most interesting person I've met in a very long time," he said. "And I'm grateful that Patricia has no subtlety whatsoever." I laughed. Real laugh. "Me too," I said. He looked over at me and smiled in his quiet, self-contained way, and we finished the dishes and went and sat in the living room. And the evening was warm and easy and exactly what it should have been. Spring came back to Davenport Street. The Cardinal Gerald returned to the fence. The garden woke up. I planted the tomatoes again, and basil, and marigolds along the border as Gerald had always insisted. Carla came to help and brought extra seedlings she had started in her greenhouse, and Douglas came by and offered unsolicited but ultimately accurate advice about drainage. Patricia came later, and the four of us sat on the porch in the April afternoon sun eating the soup I had made from last year's frozen tomatoes, the last of them, the full circle of it. The nursing cohort's second semester was underway. Destiny had begun her bachelor's program and sent me a message every few weeks, short and specific, about something she had learned or a patient she had cared for or a question she was sitting with. I answered each one, short and specific, in return. This was how the thing worked. I was learning, not the grand gesture but the consistent small one, the regular showing up. Tom said to me once that the students this year talked about me differently than they talked about other instructors. I asked what he meant. He said they didn't describe what I knew. They described how it felt to be around what I knew. I thought about that for several days. Marcus called one evening in March to ask if I would be Clara's godmother. I was at the kitchen table grading papers, a cup of tea at my elbow, and I put the pen down very carefully when he said it. He said he and Sandra had talked about it for weeks. They wanted someone who would be present and honest with her, who would tell her the true things about her life and their family and herself. Someone she could come to with the things she couldn't bring to her parents. Someone steady. I was quiet for a moment. "Marcus," I said. "Yes," he said. "I'm so honored," I said. He exhaled in a way that told me he had been holding that breath for a while. "Mom," he said, "I know we got things wrong. I know I let you down. I'm going to keep trying to get it right." "I know," I said. "I know you are." The christening was on a Sunday in May, the church full of spring light, Clara in a white dress that was mostly frill and entirely ridiculous and entirely perfect. Helen wept openly and did not pretend otherwise. Sylvia sat beside me in the pew with her hand over mine. Robert sat on my other side, steady and present and unhurried. Patricia and Carla were in the row behind, Patricia already taking photographs. Clara was carried through the ritual with the patient bewilderment of a person who does not yet know what any of this means but trusts the people carrying her. I stood at the front with her in my arms at the moment of the blessing, holding this small, serious, entirely new person, and thought, Here is where the thread continues. Summer came again, the second full summer on Davenport Street. The tomatoes came in again, even better than the year before because I knew now what I was doing and had Carla's guidance, and Gerald's bed was fully alive with the particular productive generosity of a well-tended garden. I brought tomatoes to the college and the hospital, and Douglas and Patricia and Carla and Robert and Helen and Sylvia, and still had more than I could manage. Clara, who was 7 months old and had recently discovered the existence of her feet, came to the house for Sunday brunch with Marcus and Sandra, and sat in the bouncy seat on the kitchen table and watched me make eggs with an expression of concentrated philosophical inquiry. Robert and I talked that summer about the future in the way that people do when the future is a real and specific conversation rather than an abstract one. We talked about it without pressure and without certainty, carefully and honestly, which I thought was the only way it could be talked about at this stage and at our ages. I told him things about Gerald that I had not told many people. He told me things about his wife that he had not told many people. We were sitting on the porch when most of these conversations happened, in the evenings when the light was going gold, and the world outside was quiet and the garden was doing its patient seasonal work, and there was no hurry at all. In August, I was asked to contribute a chapter to a clinical nursing textbook being compiled by the State Nursing Association. The chapter was on mentorship and the transmission of clinical knowledge. I said yes and then sat at the kitchen table for a long time with a blank document open on my laptop and thought about how to begin. I thought about the day I had started in nursing 38 years ago, green and earnest and terrified and full of wanting to do it right. I thought about the senior nurse named Vera who had worked beside me for the first 2 years and who had never made me feel stupid for what I didn't know, only purposeful about learning it. I thought about Destiny and her shaking hands. I began. The first thing a new nurse needs to know is that someone who went before them knew nothing once, and became what they are through the same uncertain process. The writing took 3 weeks. I worked on it in the evenings after dinner, at the kitchen table, the lamp making a circle of light on the page. It was harder to write than I expected, not for lack of material but for the opposite reason. 38 years of material wanting to pour in and the need to select carefully, to say only what was true and useful and would carry forward. When it was done I sent it to Dr. Holt and Dr. Foster and asked them to tell me honestly if it was good. They both wrote back within 24 hours. Dr. Holt's response was 3 paragraphs of detailed and generous feedback. Dr. Foster's was 2 words. Chapter 1. Fall arrived. Clara was nearly 1 year old and had recently learned to pull herself to standing, gripping furniture with the determined expression of someone who has decided that bipedal locomotion is going to happen on her schedule regardless of anyone's opinion. I saw her twice a week now, Tuesdays and sometimes Sundays. We had established a ritual of sorts, in which I sat on the kitchen floor with her for an hour and we examined various objects, wooden spoons and measuring cups and the small stuffed rabbit her uncle, Marcus's college friend, had sent from California. She approached each object with the same comprehensive seriousness she had applied to her own feat, and I found it endlessly instructive. The college's fall semester brought a new cohort, 15 students, slightly younger than the previous one on average. A young man named Isaiah on the first day of class said he wanted to know right away. Was this going to be a class where they learned the paperwork or the actual nursing? I told him it was going to be a class where they learned the actual nursing and then got very good at the paperwork because the paperwork was also actual nursing. He nodded, satisfied. He reminded me of a student I had worked with at the hospital in my second year of nursing, serious and direct and full of the kind of commitment that either burned out quickly or lasted a lifetime. I made a quiet note to pay attention to him. Helen turned 68 in October and I organized a dinner for her at the Italian restaurant downtown. The one with the real candles and the bread that came before you'd looked at the menu. 12 people around the table, friends and former colleagues and Patricia and Carla and Sylvia, all of whom had been brought into each other's lives through the chain of events that had begun on a morning with a dish towel and a cold cup of tea. I thought about that, sitting at the table watching Helen receive a toast in her honor, looking radiant and completely in her element. How one bad morning had cracked a door open. How through the crack an entirely different life had poured. After dinner, walking to our cars, Helen tucked her arm through mine in the cold October air. I want to say something, she said. I told her to go ahead. I have watched you this past 2 years, she said, and I want you to know that you are the best thing I've seen in a long time. What you've built. The way you've done it. I told her that she had been building it too, from her end, the whole time. She shook her head. I handed you tools, she said. You built the house. I squeezed her arm. We stood at the corner for a moment in the cold. 2 women of a certain age who had known each other for a long time and understood each other completely. Then we said good night and went our separate ways and I drove home through the October streets with the heater on and the radio low and felt the particular deep warmth of being known. November again. Clara's first birthday. Marcus and Sandra's house, the same one I had left with my suitcase 2 years before, though it felt like a different place entirely now. Or perhaps I was different and the place had simply revealed more of itself. Sandra had made a cake with a single candle, and Clara sat before it in her high chair and looked at the candle with a philosophical inquiry that was apparently her signature approach to existence. When we sang to her, she looked around at all the assembled faces with an expression of mild concern. And then the candle was blown out by someone holding her hand, and she immediately reached for the cake with both hands, and we all cheered and Helen wept, and it was exactly what it should have been. I sat beside Marcus on the sofa afterward, Clara on his lap working systematically through a piece of sponge cake. He said, not looking at me directly, watching his daughter. Mom, do you know what I think about sometimes? Said no. That morning, he said. The dish towel. He said it quietly, not the word he actually meant, which was the rest of it, what he and Sandra had said, what they had made me feel. I know, I said. I think about how different everything could have been, he said. If you had just stayed. Just absorbed it. He looked at me then. We would have gone on like that indefinitely. I don't think I would have grown up. I held his eyes for a moment. You needed to, I said. So did I. He nodded slowly. Clara offered him a piece of her cake. He accepted it with great seriousness. December the 3rd one. The Davenport house at Christmas again. By now it had accumulated another year of ornaments and memories, and the particular warm weight of a home that has been lived in and loved. The whole family came this time, all of them together, and the rooms were full of voices and the smell of food and Clara crawling at extraordinary speed toward anything she had been told not to touch. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at all of it. Helen arguing with Sylvia about the correct temperature for mulled cider, Patricia photographing everything, Carla explaining something about root vegetables to anyone who would listen, Marcus on the floor with Clara, Sandra in the kitchen actually being useful in a way that felt genuine and easy in hers. Robert standing by the window talking to Douglas, who had ended up invited because he always ended up invited and was always exactly welcome. I looked at all of it and thought, 2 years ago I was sitting in a different kitchen with a dish towel in my lap and a cold cup of tea. I thought about the hotel room and the river and the documents spread on the small table and Gerald's voice saying, "Ruthie, never put all your eggs in one basket." I thought about the teaching and the conference and the chapter in the textbook and Destiny and Isaiah and the cardinal on the fence and the tomatoes and the garden and Robert carrying the sparkling water and Helen's arm through mine in the October cold. I thought about Clara's face at the christening when she didn't know what anything meant but trusted the people holding her. I thought about the wide open space where pressure used to be. I let all of it exist at once, the way it did, the way it always does, complicated and full and entirely worth the living. That evening, after everyone had gone, I sat in the armchair by the window with chamomile tea and the small book of poems. The street outside was quiet under the December cold. The oak tree was bare but magnificent, its branches a dark, intricate pattern against the night sky. I opened the book to the page with the poem about roads and choices and the way you carry them forward. I read it softly, just to myself, just to the room. Not sadly, not nostalgically. With something that was past both of those things. Something quieter and more permanent. The kind of feeling that lives in the bone. I thought about what I would tell Clara someday about this time in her grandmother's life. About the morning that looked like an ending and turned out to be the beginning of the most alive I had ever been. I would tell her, there will be a morning when someone hands you a thing that is meant to make you small. You will have a choice in that moment. The choice is not whether to feel the weight of it because you will feel it. The choice is what you do next. I would tell her that what you do next is everything. That the life on the other side of that moment, if you will only move toward it, is yours. That you are 63 or 23 or 43, and there is so much good time ahead. I placed the book on the side table and finished my tea. The Cardinal Gerald was asleep somewhere in the oak tree. The wind chime on the porch turned in the cold air. Tomorrow I would have tea in the backyard and plan the spring garden and call Destiny and go to the Tuesday walking group with Patricia and Carla and probably go to the farmer's market afterward because there was always something good at the farmer's market in December if you knew where to look. And someday, in however many springs it took, I would sit on this porch with Clara beside me and show her the garden and tell her that her great-grandfather built that bed with his own hands, and she would press her small fingers into the dirt the way I had, and something would pass between us that had no name but didn't need one. I am 63 years old, Ruth Calloway, retired nurse, teacher, mentor, grandmother, friend. I sat in my armchair in my own house on Davenport Street and felt the full, unhurried weight of a life that had found its way to itself at last. Not despite the dish towel but, in some complicated and real way because of it. Because the crack let in the light. Because I had packed my suitcase and walked out the door and stood by the hotel window looking at the river and remembered what Gerald had said and called Helen and sat in the church and walked beside Patricia and taught Destiny and planted tomatoes and written a chapter and held Clara at the christening and given the keynote and said yes to dinner and yes to this house and yes, over and over, to the life that had been waiting. If you are watching this and you have been sitting in someone else's kitchen feeling like a piece of furniture, if you are watching this and you are 60 or 63 or 70 and someone has told you that your use is laundry and floors, if you are watching this and you have been waiting for permission to go and find your worth somewhere else, I want to tell you something. You do not need permission. You already have everything you need. You have 30 or 40 or 50 years of hard-won knowledge and the particular fierce strength of someone who has survived that much living. You have people who will sit in your corner if you will only let them see you clearly. You have a garden that wants planting. You have students who need what you know. You have a life that is waiting not ahead of you but already here, already yours, already begun. Go make your tea. Pack your bag if you need to. Write your note and walk out the door. The river will be there. The hotel room will be clean. Helen will pick up on the second ring. The house on Davenport Street exists for everyone who is willing to go find it by whatever name it has for them. The place that is theirs, the life that is theirs, the morning that is finally entirely their own. You are not old. You are not used up. You are not the dish towel. You are 63 years old, and there is so much good time still ahead of you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let anyone make you small. Go be enormous. If this story reached something in you today, if Ruth's voice sounded like something you needed to hear, please subscribe to Granny's Voice and leave a comment below. Tell me what part of her story you carried with you. I read every word. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, share it with them right now. This story is for them too. This is Granny's Voice. We'll see you in the next story.